After a rather long hiatus, I'll get back to this podcast series. I see it's been just over a month since the last episode. I'm trying to cycle through the 3 podcasts, and eventually I'd like to get an episode published in each one every week. That's probably a stretch, so perhaps 2 episodes every month for each of the podcasts would be more doable. As some would say, life happens. Company comes, medical appointments roll around, then there's always work. The freelance translation business is fickle. It reminds me of Ogden Nash's bit of verse describing the problem we all encounter with a ketchup bottle. Although maybe not so much now that most ketchup comes in plastic bottles. His poem went like this: the ketchup bottle, first a little, then a lottle. This past month has had the added challenge of setting up my own website, www.erpotterpodcast.com. I have the podcast hosted here in one convenient location, and there are other items on the website as well. There are some variations and additions and improvements I want to make for the site, but at least it's up and running. All going well, I should be able to add the transcripts for each of the podcasts when I get around to working on it again. Unless you've gone back and listened to the previous episode, you may need a brief reminder of where we are in the Bible story, where we are in general history. Biblically speaking, the book of Judges takes up the story of Israel's departure from Egypt, after God left them there for 400 years after Joseph was sold by his brothers to a passing caravan. He was taken to Egypt, and his death there closes the book of Genesis. The next book, Exodus, takes up the story 400 years later as God raises up Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. They now numbered over 1 million people, compared to the 70 or so members of Joseph's family who had emigrated to Egypt. Here's a short outline of the history of Israel in these books. The book of Exodus relates Moses' calling and ministry in getting the Israelites out of Egypt. Like the other books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which were compiled by Moses, Exodus takes its name from the Greek word that describes what the book is about. Genesis means origins or beginning, and describes the creation and the choice of a family that would be the foundation for a people God had been preparing and through which the Savior would come, that he had promised to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Exodus is the Greek word for the way out. Think of exit. The family leaves Egypt. Leviticus concentrates on the Levitical law that was designed to govern the everyday life of this special family God was turning into a nation in its own right. Numbers includes just that, a lot of numbers. The census of the tribes and families who would enter Canaan, the land promised to Abraham over 400 years before. It also details the 40 years the Israelites traveled through the wilderness and why they had to do that, until an entire disobedient generation had passed away. Deuteronomy is the Greek word for second law, and basically it's Moses giving the law again, this time to the new generation who would enter the promised land. He, however, would not enter in, so it's sort of a final word he passes on at the end of his life. The book of Joshua is just that, the story of the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua, as they actually enter the land of Canaan and battle to gain a foothold and possess it. Although the territory was never completely conquered, it was sufficiently subdued for Joshua to parcel out the portions of land that belonged to each of the 12 tribes. Joshua's death is a transition point into the book of Judges, which covers the time between Joshua's death and the establishment of the kingdom of Israel with the anointing of Saul as the first king. The story of Israel and her kings continues on in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. In some versions and languages, these books are appropriately called 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. Now, where do all this fit in the universal history of the area? As we look at the time of the judges, we should have some notion of what was going on in the world at that time. These dates are approximate, as scholars themselves disagree as to the precise dating of some of the events, but for our purposes, this will serve to help us understand the general setting of the story we're looking at. By all accounts, archaeological and biblical, the Exodus took place around 1400 BC or soon thereafter. That would place the death of Joseph in Egypt at the beginning of Israel's sojourn there in the neighborhood of 1800 BC. The book of Exodus, with the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, followed by a period of, say, 40 years or so under Joshua's leadership, would put us at around 1300 for the start of the time of the judges. The start of the kingdom, around the year 1000 BC under Saul and David, is one of the stakes that historians have driven down in terms of dating, due to the specific references in the biblical and secular history to the timing of the dedication of Solomon's temple. If you read secular history accounts, you'll find references to the Paleolithic, Neolithic, Stone Ages, or the Bronze Age, early, middle, or late, and the Iron Age, so-called because of the predominant use of these materials in weapons and tools in those times. Obviously, the objects of stone and metal are the most likely to survive thousands of years and provide archaeologists with something to gauge the era, to assign to their discoveries, and to help understand what was going on at the same time across cultures and continents. The period of the Judges, 1300 to 1000 BC, more or less, falls in the period often called the Late Bronze Age, which gave way to the Iron Age, right at the time the monarchy is instituted in Israel with Saul and David. So if you read about some archaeological find related to Greece, Great Britain, or Central Asia in the Late Bronze Age, or at the start of the Iron Age, pause a moment and remember what was going on in what we call Israel today, the stories we're familiar with from the biblical account. The geopolitical setting of the time of the Judges is something we need to look at too. The previous episode highlighted the unstable nature of life in the time of the Judges. There were great victories, there were great defeats. There were acts of valor and acts of unspeakable depravity. The main point was that there was a need for stable leadership in order for a group or society to prosper, and that's true at every level, in every age. But it will help us understand the events of the book of Judges and Joshua before it if we have an overall picture of how that part of the world operated politically and socially in those times. There are 3 points I'd like to make. First of all, don't forget about Egypt. Just because Israel left Egypt doesn't mean Egypt had left Israel. At this time in history, Egypt had already been a powerhouse, economically, militarily, politically, for nearly 2,000 years. That sort of dwarfs the 250-year celebration of the signing of the U.S. Declaration of Independence coming up in 4 years, doesn't it? The vast Roman Empire lasted only 800 years. Although Portugal doesn't cover a vast territory, it can boast of nearly 1,000 years of a stable border. And in this time, it controlled territories around the globe. But Egypt still beats them all and lasted over another 1,000 years after the Exodus, totaling almost 3,000 years. Egypt had everything. Principally, it had the Nile River and its fertile delta. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. Not only could it produce the crops, it had access to the Mediterranean Sea to the north to ship goods in all directions. They could ship upriver to Africa in the south. Even Abraham went south to Egypt in a time of drought. And it was a similar situation that drove Jacob and his family to Egypt. History records floods of immigrants going into Egypt from the desert on the west and from the desert to the east. It was not unlike what America has faced and is facing from the time of its founding. Back in those days, it was the Egyptian dream, not the American dream, that the hordes of immigrants were chasing. The build-up to the Exodus including the measures by Pharaoh to control the increasing numbers of the Hebrews, was just one of the immigrant issues Egypt faced over its long history. Whether these immigrants could be classified as illegal immigrants is another question. The ease of travel in the last couple of centuries has created the need for more passport controls, visas, immigration laws. Did Egypt have immigration laws? I don't know, but I bet the locals would have been glad to have closed the borders at times. When Moses asked Pharaoh to allow the Hebrews to return to the land of Canaan, from which they had come 400 years before, Pharaoh was very aware of where Canaan was and what it represented. Egypt, the great economic powerhouse, depended on international trade, the silks, spices, precious metals from the east, and even horses from the north of where Turkey is today. And all that trade by land had to pass through that narrow strip of land along the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea. The trade routes went north to Lebanon, or turned eastward to the north end of the Sea of Galilee, and from there to Damascus and Syria before heading further east to areas that over the centuries were controlled by Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and so on. All the towns in Canaan had Egyptian administrative officials to guarantee the continued flow of trade back and forth through that piece of land. Egypt had military installations at Joppa on the Mediterranean coast during the time of David. It protected Egypt's maritime shipping interests as well as the overland route. I have a photo I took of a sign on the wall that still stands that was part of that garrison built back around the year 1000 BC. These Egyptian officials reported to the Pharaoh regarding the political situation in their area. A trove of correspondence on clay tablets was found at Amarna in Egypt, sent by authorities in Canaan to the Pharaoh during the time of Joshua and the period of the Judges. Secondly, don't think of Buckingham Palace and the British royalty when you read about the kings in Canaan. Back in the book of Genesis, as early as chapter 14, we read of Abram going to the rescue of his nephew Lot, who had chosen to live in the city of Sodom. This was before the time of the final destruction of Sodom and other cities by God in chapter 19 of Genesis. See episode 3 of the podcast, How Shall We Live in Times Like These? The Zoar Syndrome, for a story related to that time of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the time of Abram, the 4 kings went to war against 5 kings, and they included the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and Zoar, and Lot was taken captive. That account gives us insight into the nature of what the term king meant in that time. Sodom, Gomorrah, and Zoar each had a king, so the extent of each kingdom could not have extended much farther than the surrounding populations that depended on each city for their provisions and protection. The text of the Amarna letters from the time of Joshua and Judges confirm the fact that this was still the case during the Hebrew occupation of Canaan. In these letters, written by the kings of the Canaanite cities, they appealed to Pharaoh for military or administrative aid to deal with incursions by local neighboring kings. They make a point of listing all the ways they proved to be loyal to the interests of Pharaoh, and therefore they feel justified in asking for Egyptian royal support of their cause. In short, they were at best vassal kings, paying their tribute to the Pharaoh for the privilege of retaining their position as a local ruler. In the Amarna letters, they are referred to as mayors, that is, local tribal leaders, chieftains, if you will, a far cry from the images we have of royalty today. In turn, Egypt effectively maintained control over this strategic strip of land without having to assign more of its own officials to hold the fort. In large part, the local rivalries were allowed to go after one another as long as the overall interests of Egypt were not harmed. Many years later, Solomon married one of Pharaoh's daughters to seal peace with the superpower, 1 Kings 9:24, and he was actively involved in horse trading between the Hittites in the north, where Turkey is today, and Egypt in the south, 1 Kings 10 verses 28 and 29. During the reign of King Josiah of Judah, the Pharaoh Necho felt obliged to intervene to help Assyria. Josiah, who felt threatened by Assyria, joined in the battle at Megiddo and was killed by Pharaoh Necho. 2 Kings 23. So, again, although Egypt is rarely referred to in the books of Joshua and Judges, and when it is, it's a reminder to Israel of the slavery from which they had been redeemed, Egypt's power and influence are always overshadowing all of life. During the time of the Babylonian invasion, Egypt was seen as a way to escape the judgment of God, and Jeremiah and others warned against seeking the help of Egypt. Israel had been redeemed from the power of Egypt, but it was not free from the realm of its influence. There's a lesson here for us who have been redeemed from the bondage of sin, the Egypt of our past. We too are still within the realm of sin's influence. 1 John 5:19 says, "We know that we are of God, and the whole world is under the sway of the evil one." We, like the Jews of Jeremiah's time, may be tempted to turn to the world as a means of increasing our power and influence or alleviating the burden that carrying the cross of Christ places on us. We've been freed from the power of sin, but not from the presence of sin. Finally, let's look at the way war was done in those days. As we move into the analysis of the book of Judges, we find the Israelites in a seesaw relationship with Midianites, Philistines, and other peoples, advancing and retreating. Now, in the summer of 2022, we witness the ongoing battles in Ukraine, the cities and regions taken by Russia and then reclaimed by Ukraine, and Russia trying to get them back. We're not used to seeing international borders flaunted in this way. But historically, that's the story of war. Only in the last couple of generations, with organizations such as the United Nations, we've become accustomed to the concept of internationally recognized borders. Compare the map of Europe before and after World War I. Note how the borders shifted. In the aftermath of World War II, borders shifted again. More recently, the Yugoslavia we learned about in school has disappeared. It's now divided into new nations. It's still unclear what will happen in Ukraine, but in the end there will be some sort of agreement recognized internationally, or maybe not. Maybe like Taiwan and the Republic of China, stalemate, or the North and South Korea standoff. Then there's the Israeli-Palestinian question of borders and sovereignty that occupies the concerns of nations around the world. But no such rules existed when the children of Israel entered Canaan. All the players knew and recognized the rules. The basic rule was, take as much as you can, hold it for as long as you can, until someone bigger and stronger takes it away from you. That's the rule Hitler played by. Putin feels the same way. Their guiding principle has been, might makes right. The closest modern-day illustration I can think of is soccer, or football, as it's called in the rest of the world. The playing field is constantly shifting. The objective is to take possession of the ball, keep it while you can, take it back from the other team, and score every chance you get. As long as you respect the rules of how to take the ball away or retain control of it, have at it. It's yours. You're not obligated to let the other team play with the ball. And that's the difference between soccer and baseball or cricket. These sports have rules about who gets the ball and how long they can keep it, and then it's the other team's turn. Each team has the right to equal opportunities to score. There were no set borders in the days of the judges. Tribes and peoples invaded whenever they felt they could and retreated when they saw they couldn't retain control. That was the principle behind the Assyrian, the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. And behind those wars lay the honor of the God each nation fought for. Victory or defeat in battle was directly attributed to the gods in question. The battles we'll come across in our study all come back to that point. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob chose a people that through whom he would demonstrate who the true God is. We see that in the way the battles were fought. It is no less true today. We are the people God has chosen, through whom He will demonstrate that He alone is God, sovereign and almighty. Our archenemy still plays by the rules of old. In other words, no rules. Anything goes, no holds barred. We dare not face him with our strategies and strength. Like Israel, we're to trust in God alone, and we will see the victory over the enemy. The book of Judges is full of lessons for us in this battle against sin. And since there's no way we can avoid the battle, we'd best be prepared to win it.